There's an old story I rather enjoy about a country farmer and his son who were staying for the first time in one of these newfangled hotel things. As they went on a visit to a city, they were astounded by all the modern miracles that they were seeing for the first time. The farmer watched an old woman get into a lift in the hotel lobby and the doors magically closed. Then a few moments later, the doors swooshed open again and out came a gorgeous young woman. Well, you can imagine what the farmer's reaction was. He said, "Wow," he said to his son, "they have a machine for turning old women into beautiful young women. Go and get your mother, son." I just love that story. And I imagine the farmer's awe, his sense of wow, being rather similar to what the disciples must have felt on that day when Jesus ascended into heaven. For them, it must have been even more of a miracle than Jesus rising from the dead, because this happened right before their eyes. They didn't see Jesus rise from the dead. They just met him after the fact. They're standing with him on a mountaintop outside Jerusalem or Galilee. Depends on whether you believe Luke's account or Matthew's account, but we'll come back to that. According to Matthew's account, he gives them what we call the Great Commission, a command to take his message into the four corners of the world. Matthew doesn't say exactly what happened next. For that, we need Luke in the book of Acts, who tells us that Jesus was lifted up and a cloud hid him from their sight. You can just imagine them standing around like that farmer, can't you? Mouth open, looking at each other and then up into the sky and saying, "Huh? What's happened?" It's a good question. It's a good question for us as well. As we encounter this story in the 21st century, as we do. What exactly happened that day? Interestingly, Matthew's account contains no reference to Jesus disappearing, let alone being taken up into heaven. Mark and John, in their Gospels, are both totally silent about the story. They don't mention it at all, which is rather surprising. It's only Luke who tells us this particular story. And even he changes the details. You see, Luke tells the story twice. First of all, he tells it at the end of his gospel, where he says that having blessed his disciples, Jesus withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. That sounds to me, anyway, a bit more like a statement of belief, a kind of logical conclusion from what had happened. Jesus withdrew is the description of a teacher who gives his blessing and then wanders off to be alone, a bit as I shall withdraw at the end of this service into the vestry. Yeah. One wonders if the reason that Luke adds "and was taken up into heaven" is because the disciples didn't see Jesus again after he had withdrawn from them. So, probably, it means he must have been taken up into heaven, doesn't it? Well, Luke's first account, intriguingly, is at the heart of various mythologies about Jesus' continuing ministry on earth. According to the Mormon faith, for example, Jesus essentially left his disciples, withdrew from them, then got in a boat and sailed to America, where he founded an entirely new civilization. That's what the Mormons believe. There are other stories as well of Jesus, for example, making his way to the Middle East, even as far as India. Now, I have to say, there is absolutely no contemporaneous historical accounts of this. Both the story of Jesus going to India and indeed the Mormon story are early 20th century, or at the best, late 19th century additions, shall we say, to the mythology of Jesus. But those rumours do persist in the dark corners of the internet, and indeed in the very much alive myths of the Mormon Church, which is why I always counsel people to be a little bit cautious when you get approached in the street by members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Perhaps the uncertainty that Luke left in his gospel is why in his second book, the book of Acts, he was at such pains to give a much clearer and unambiguous statement. You can kind of imagine Luke between the end of writing his gospel and seeing how that had been received amongst the Christian community of the time, and then writing the book of Acts, thinking to himself, I have left that ending a bit open to interpretation, haven't I? Perhaps I'd better fill in a few more details. So the account from Acts that Sandra read for us just now is much more specific. Jesus doesn't withdraw, that word is gone, but rather Luke says he was lifted up and a cloud hid him from his disciples' sight. Now, of course, you can reconcile these two things. It's perfectly possible to describe being hidden by a cloud as a kind of withdrawing. But that is not, in fact, the clear inference of Luke. He goes on to emphasize in his new version that the disciples were standing around, stunned and gazing into the sky until two men in white, not mentioned in his earlier account at all, we assume these to be angels, by the way, arrived to kind of explain what's just happened and to give hope to these frantic disciples who've just lost their Lord. Now, from our 21st century perspective, it has to be admitted this all sounds a bit fanciful, doesn't it? For one thing, we no longer believe, as Luke believed, that heaven is up there and hell is down there. That's what's known amongst the scholarly community as the triple-decker universe model. Yeah, so you've got heaven there, you've got earth, hell down there, and you've got earth in between, like a sandwich filling. Yeah, triple-decker universe. Yeah. Well, that's really been largely discarded as a view, along, incidentally, with the idea of a flat earth having four corners to which the gospel message should be taken. Yeah, these are ideas we have discarded. In fact, what 21st century science offers us is what I consider a far more intriguing idea, namely the concept of the multiverse. Have you heard of this? Well, according to various discoveries in physics, it's theoretically possible for there to be multiple dimensions, multiple universes, which are existing side by side, but which are invisible to us because we are born into this universe. Our brains can only cope with what we see in our universe. But the behavior of certain subatomic particles, which appear to be able to wink in and out of existence, where do they go, is the question scientists ask. Well, they suggest that there may indeed be a way to travel from one universe to another. Perhaps heaven, and perhaps hell too, are such places, alternative universes that sit alongside ours. Perhaps heaven is a realm that coexists with our reality, separated by physical laws that we're only just beginning to understand, even with the technology of CERN. Perhaps there are even moments when we are capable, through faith, of peeking through the veil between this world and heaven. Perhaps this is what Jesus was referring to when he says the kingdom of heaven is among you. Perhaps there are places on earth where humans have for centuries described the sense of thinness thin places. You know how people talk about beautiful church buildings or beautiful religious sites, or even in the more pagan communities, sites like Stonehenge and so forth, as being thin places where one feels one can almost touch God. Perhaps such places are places where peace and the beauty of heaven feel close enough for us to touch. Perhaps those are the moments when heaven touches earth through the subatomic barrier. Just like when, for example, Jesus met Elijah and Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. Perhaps they stepped through into our reality for those moments. Or perhaps when those angels, those men in white that were in the account of Acts, perhaps when those men suddenly appear to explain to the disciples that Jesus has gone and they will one day see him return, perhaps they too were able to step subatomically from one universe to another, from one heaven into our earth. Perhaps after diligent and constant prayer ourselves, we also can touch the veil between us and heaven. Perhaps we ourselves can sense the presence of God. All that's conjecture, of course. I used the word perhaps a lot just to get us thinking. But I wanted to explore how it is possible to read Scripture's variable and in some cases competing accounts of this key event in Jesus' life and still find a way to live with the mystery of what the writers of Scripture have left us. The underlying truth that differing accounts of this moment all point to is this: Jesus is no longer confined to a physical, earthly body with all its limitations of time and space. His message, his love, his presence, if you will, are available to all people, not just to those who manage to track him down to a particular time and place. This is, if you like, a narrative of expansion. Jesus' message, Jesus' love, carried by his disciples, both then and now through you and me, can be likened, if you will, to a firework let off and fired into the sky to then burst in a blaze of glory and shower the entire world. For as Jesus said in Matthew's account, "Behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." And that, my friends, is something we can certainly celebrate with joy when we cry, "Alleluia, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia."